Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Welcome to our 12th episode of our podcast, Tuesdays Against Executions. This is Antonietta here with you, and today I'm very happy to host Mr. Ken Roth, former executive director of until 2022 of Human Rights Watch. So we are going to have a general conversation about the prevention of arbitrary detention and have a kind of general conversation and try to make reference to the present situation of escalation of arbitrary executions in Iran today. So just some reference, I think that between the data we had until now, between August and September 22nd, around 186 executions have been carried out. Think that the majority of them are carried out silently in the prisons, in the different prisons in the country, and especially in Qusar prison, which is one of the most with the highest number of silently execution at the moment. I would like to recall to the public and share with you, Mr. Roth, that now the movement Tuesdays Against Execution is composed by prisoners in 52 prisons around the country. So, and we are at the moment at the 87th week of strikes in the prison. So thank you for joining us, Mr. Roth.
I'm very happy to be with you in this very important movement. I think the aims of this movement to try to stop these horrible executions and curtail the Iranian government's repression is very, very important. So I'm very happy to be able to do my small part and join you.
Thank you. So what is, in your opinion, the escalation, a so higher number in such reduced time of executions, considering that in the case of Iran and other countries, of course, and unfortunately all around the world, the abuse of death penalty is a sort of sanction or normal sanction. But what is, in your idea, the escalation in Iran and in other in other countries? I would like to, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that Iran is upgraded, unfortunately, on the list of the country with the higher number of arbitrary executions.
Yeah, I prefer to think of it as a downgrading, but you're right. I mean, Iran is one of the leading executioners in the world. Yeah. I mean, maybe before I answer your question directly, let me take a step backwards and just, remind everybody what's so horrible about executions. Because, executions are inherently cruel. They're something the state should never do to anybody. Even a serious crime can be addressed with imprisonment. There are other forms of punishment. Executions are inherently arbitrary because even in states that say reserve the death penalty for, we're supposed to be the most serious crimes, they don't, for example, execute everybody who is charged with murder. They execute a subset of people. And that subset is almost always composed of ethnic minorities, of people who are, more impoverished, people don't have the means to push back and ensure that they're not executed. And so, because almost every state cannot afford the public outrage that would come from executing, every single convicted criminal of a certain kinds of crimes, they always pick and choose. And that process of picking and choosing is always arbitrary. Now, to make matters worse in a place like Iran, these executions are coming after unfair trials. These are often closed trials. They are often trials before, a judge that is not independent. People are railroaded to a conviction. And that makes it all the worse. I mean, to be, convicted on the basis of, say, a tortured, involuntary confession, and then to be executed on the basis of that is utterly unfair. It just compounds the cruelty of the death penalty. And in those circumstances, you obviously can get people who didn't commit any crime, let alone, any crime that supposedly merits the death penalty.
Sorry to interrupt you. In the case of Iran, last June, we saw with another host, Professor Devaren, Iran adopted a law. It seems so general that everything just like corruption in the earth is sufficient to sentence someone to death.
No, exactly. In other words, the crimes, so-called crimes that people are being convicted of in Iran are not generally recognized crimes. These are just, terms that are used to criminalize opposition to the dictatorial government. And so, when somebody is convicted of a crime in Iran, that often doesn't mean anything in terms of, a crime that would be recognized in the rest of the world, like murder. It's often just political opposition. These are very politicized convictions. And then, to make matters worse, the victim is executed. So that's all just by way of background. Now, your question was, why do we see this acceleration, this intensified crackdown? And, I think that there's one reason going back, say, 3 years, and one that is much more immediate. I mean, obviously, the government was very much rattled by the women life freedom protests, which is only the latest round of protests. I mean, periodically there have been protests, but this was, very widespread. It illustrated the broad distaste for the government. The fact that the public wanted out. The public doesn't want to be ruled by this dictatorial regime. That terrified the government. So that has, really sparked a new round of repression. And then, the most recent spark has been, the Israeli government's attacks on the nuclear program. And, I should say first that, there clearly was a way to negotiate to avoid the war. The Iranian government made quite clear that so long as it maintained the right that every other country has to enrich uranium to some level, that it was willing to accept quite intrusive inspections as a way of avoiding the development of a nuclear weapon. That should have been an easy deal to arrive at. It probably would have been, a slight variation from the deal that Obama had. One that would have had longer term guarantees, maybe more intrusive guarantees against nuclear weapon. But that's not what Netanyahu wanted. Netanyahu wanted to go to war. He wanted to seize this opportunity to attack the nuclear program, even if, that indeed, probably provides a greater incentive to develop the program. But, that said, once the Israelis attacked, it was incredibly embarrassing because it became clear that Israel had infiltrated spies into Iran, that Israel knew a whole lot more about where, nuclear scientists or other important officials lived or worked, that Israel was able to very quickly neutralize the, supposedly highly vaunted missile defense that was there. And so, Israel very quickly came in and was able to bomb at will. And to be able to carry out attacks even from the ground, using drones or other tools from people who had been infiltrated in, or people who had decided to become agents of Israel.
Thank you for saying that. Sorry to interrupt you, because this allow me, and thank you to underline the reference to the visit of international inspections, any kind of monitoring from international inspections, because this is a reminder about the current global situation of I don't want to use that term, of declining, but maybe it's the most opportune, declining of multilateralism and the interest to find a solution without any kind of use of force or abuse of international law, better said. So, and the situation you mentioned is one of the reasons, perhaps, I don't know what you think, perhaps also of an increasing situation of uncertainty also for people of Iran, because the suspect of presence of spies or opposition inside the country is increasingly high inside the country. So you can see that in the increasing number of arbitrary detention and, of course, executions.
Yeah, no, that was my point. In other words, this is a very embarrassing situation for the government. And what governments tend to do when they're embarrassed is they lash out. They blame anybody but themselves. And so, Iran is now rounding people up, supposedly to identify the spies. But of course, they probably have no idea who the spies are. They're just picking people up who are suspects, presumably torturing them, maybe not even bothering, but they're executing people. And they want to, pretend to be doing something about the problem. And so, once somebody's dead, nobody, knows what they did or what they didn't do. And this is a way for the government to then claim, aha, we've retaliated. We found the problem. The people who suffer are the people who are just arbitrarily rounded up and killed. So that's the dangerous situation.
Actually, we are in a general situation where everyone at level of is member of international community, at least I refer to state, everyone is doing whatever he wants, it seems. So if Iran in some way Iran is killing his people, okay, let's Iran killing his people. If Israel wants to eliminate from the face of the globe an entire population, okay, let's do it. Let's give him any chance to do it. So I understand that. And
well, let me, if I could step in there, because I mean, you're describing, the attitude of maybe certain individuals. I'm sure, Vladimir Putin is perfectly happy for Iran to crack down on whomever. He's doing that in Russia. Trump obviously could care less that Netanyahu is committing genocide in Gaza. But I wouldn't generalize too far from that. I think, most of the world is outraged by what Israel is doing in Gaza. Most of the world is outraged by the Iranian government's repression. I think it was completely clear, most recently with the women life freedom protests, that the Iranian people, want democracy. They want a government that is accountable to them. They want a government which they can, influence with their voice, with their media, with their civil society, with elections. And that's not what they have. They're stuck with this dictatorship that is clinging to power by the barrel of a gun. So I think most of the world really sympathizes with the Iranian people and understands the brutality of the regime. But they understand that there's a battle underway. The people don't have the weapons, the regime has the weapons. And the question is always, how do you emerge from that? And the women life freedom protests were an effort to do that. But, the Iranian government just brought in the thugs, brought in the Basij, brought in, whomever would use violence to defend it. And that's how it clung to power. Now, that is a very short-term strategy because, most dictatorships still prefer to rule by popular consent. They may not allow elections, but they want, most people to say, oh, these aren't so bad. They're our leaders. They're doing some good. I think the Iranian government is beyond that now. It's clinging to power just because it has the military force. It has lost the legitimacy that comes from any claim of popular consent. So that's a very precarious situation. I mean, I just think about Bashar al-Assad, the longtime Syrian dictator, who, by the end, nobody loved this guy. He was just hanging on through sheer brutality, through executions, through arbitrary detention, through torture. It looked very much like the Iranian regime. And in the case of Syria, when the HTS rebel group emerged from Idlib province and started marching toward Damascus, nobody stopped it. Nobody wanted to defend Assad. And it just took over at lightning speed, shocking everybody. That's obviously, the terrifying possible scenario that the clerics in Tehran are worried about, that there's a limit to their brutality, that they can hang on by the barrel of the gun, but that's, a very tough thing to do for the long term. And so, that provides some modicum of hope for the Iranian people, but it also means that for the moment, they're in a very difficult situation because they're subject to this kind of repression, this brutality, as epitomized by these mounting executions.
Thank you very much. I would like to pick up few elements of your reaction. So the first one is that maybe I didn't believe that someone could be more optimist than me, but it seems you are in the present situation, at least. When you say that when you reduce to responsibility to the head of state in singular case, Putin, you mentioned Netanyahu, and the long list that we have, unfortunately, but they are always a state. And unfortunately, they are representative of that state and they act independently and autonomously into the international community. And we are seeing that. I agree with you that there is a kind of public support and increasing public awareness in the public opinion in relation to Iran, in relation of the tragedy of Gaza. But the action is still going on. That's the point. And the other aspect I would like to, one more aspect is the fact that you mentioned Syria, and thank you for doing that. Let me say that at that time, the unique one trying to take action, because we need to have action, not just support, was President Obama. You already mentioned in relation to Syria, the unique one. At least in my memory, maybe I have trouble with my memory. And then you mentioned the women revolution of Iran. I used to strongly support women of Iran. Sharifeh Mohammadi, who has been recently confirmed sentenced to death penalty, of course, with an unjust trial, an unfair and unjust trial, who is just one representative, actually, of the action against women. And it's interesting that you mentioned the movement of 2022, because we are at the anniversary of the loss of Amini, who so courageously fight it in the square just to express herself. And this give me the wish. I wish to ask you a question in relation to young people of Iran, because we are at the start of a new academic year, and we are increasingly saying everywhere, we are seeing with the flotilla case going to Gaza, the majority of people is young people, is increasingly involved in such international situation of injustice everywhere. So what is your opinion about that, not only in relation to Iran, but also in relation to Iran?
I'm not quite
so
sure.
the role of young people, because you mentioned the reference to.
Okay. Yeah. Look at, I mean, young people, are often the ones who are freest to act in the face of injustice. It's often university students and younger people who are just starting off in life who, are not as restrained by family responsibilities, by having a job and the like. They often serve as the conscience of society and also as the ones who are most willing to take to the streets and act. And I think it's just kind of a product of their stage in life. But we've seen, many, many student-led protests, ultimately student-led revolutions. And so, I do think that young people who obviously have grown up under this regime, but also have grown up very aware of the evil of the regime, its capacity for brutality, its indifference for ordinary Iranians, its prioritization of its own power. They're the ones who know firsthand this reality and have, the combination of the greatest incentive and the greatest capacity to resist. So I do think that young people have a key role to play in trying to create an Iran that is freer and far less repressive than today's reality.
So I have another question to you. Do you think that, because just last day I was thinking, tried to compare, it is not good to make a comparative analysis of period of time, right? But sometimes I can't prevent myself to do it. And I was thinking into early 20th century, after the pandemic of 20th century, how the situation degenerated at that time, and to the present situation after the pandemic. I can't prevent myself to think that this kind of degeneration of multilateralism is also a kind of consequences of the pandemic.
I'm not sure
no?
I'm not sure I could say one way or the other. I mean, the pandemic obviously was a globally traumatic event.
Yeah.
It forced people to sort of radically change their lives for a period. It highlighted global inequities because vaccines became available in some parts of the world far more quickly than others. But I'm not in a position to say how the pandemic really played out in Iran. I just don't know. That's not my area of expertise.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So I don't want to abuse of your time. I feel really honored.
No, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. I really appreciate that. And I wish you a lot of luck.
But just I would like to ask you if you want to just send a direct message to people of Iran of support, because we used to ask to every host.
Yeah, and I'm happy to do that. I mean, my message is really that, the world is very much aware of the repression and the suffering that the people of Iran are undergoing. And we recognize that this is, a brutal regime bent on maintaining power at whatever cost. And that, the people of Iran want the same thing that people around the world want. They want, the freedom to live their lives. They want the ability to influence their government. They want a government that serves them, not itself. These are very basic human aspirations that the Iranian people share with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world hopes, that the Iranian people can achieve this sooner rather than later. There is broad sympathy for your suffering, and there is a broad desire that you are able to continue with these efforts to secure freedom and obtain a radical change in the way that you're governed. So all my best to this effort. And thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us and for your support.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.